On January 7, 1942, Adolf Hitler, ensconced in his East Prussian command post, pronounced a judgment upon America that would irrevocably determine Germany's destiny. He confided to his closest advisors that he perceived little promise for the United States, characterizing it as a nation in decline. He cited their internal challenges, namely their racial strife and the pervasive issue of social disparities. He contended that the very fabric of American society betrayed its deep-seated assimilation of Jewish influences and a significant augmentation of its black population, questioning how such a nation could possibly endure. Meanwhile, 7,000 miles away, within the modest confines of a shipyard office in Richmond, California, a 57-year-old industrial magnate named Henry Kaiser was engrossed in sketching on a hotel notepad. He possessed no prior experience in shipbuilding. His prior endeavors focused on the construction of dams, roads, and bridges. Ships, however, represented a far greater complexity. Established shipbuilding enterprises estimated 8 months for the fabrication of a single cargo vessel. Kaiser, contemplating his nascent drawing, confidently informed his team that they would complete one in a mere 4 days. Hitler held the conviction that Americans were inherently weak. Kaiser was poised to demonstrate the catastrophic inaccuracy of this belief. This profound miscalculation originated well before the initial hostilities commenced. In the years preceding the war, German military intelligence meticulously gathered intelligence on America's industrial capabilities, its military preparedness, and its national character. Their conclusions remained remarkably consistent. America was a land of merchants and consumers, not soldiers. In 1939, its army ranked among the world's smallest, even fewer than Portugal's. Its factories churned out automobiles and refrigerators, not tanks and aircraft. Its populace, having enjoyed extended peace, had developed an aversion to hardship and sacrifice. Hitler's advisors assured him that American claims regarding war production were mere fabrication. When President Franklin Roosevelt declared in May of 1940 that the United States would achieve an annual production of 50,000 aircraft, the German High Command dismissed it as fantasy. In 1939, American military aircraft production had totaled fewer than 3,000 planes. The notion that this figure could be amplified by a factor of nearly 20 seemed utterly preposterous. Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe and a trusted confidant of Hitler, shared his leader's disdain. Goering had meticulously built the German Air Force from its nascent stages into Europe's most formidable aerial military force. He possessed an intimate understanding of the intricate processes involved in producing modern combat aircraft, from the exacting precision engineering and specialized alloys to the highly trained workforce and the years of refinement required for production methodologies. America, he believed, lacked all these prerequisites. The idea that they could suddenly conjure an air force from automobile factories struck him as ludicrous. The German generals had prior experience confronting Americans. During the final year of the First World War, American troops had arrived in France and performed adequately, but their intervention was late. Their casualties were comparatively light when measured against the European powers, and their contribution to the war's strategic direction was minimal. The lingering memory of those doughboys reinforced the perception that Americans lacked the fortitude for sustained conflict. Albert Speer, who would later assume the role of Hitler's Minister of Armaments, frequently attended his leaders' dinner discussions concerning America. Hitler maintained that the Americans had played a rather insignificant role in the 1914 to 1918 conflict, enduring minimal bloodshed. He surmised they would be incapable of withstanding a true trial by fire, given their perceived low combat proficiency. In Hitler's general assessment, a unified American populace simply did not exist. He viewed them merely as a conglomeration of immigrants from numerous nations and diverse ethnicities. This racial analysis was fundamental to Hitler's ideological framework. He posited that national strength stemmed directly from racial purity and homogeneity. Germany, with its purported Aryan bloodline, possessed an inherent supremacy that would manifest decisively on the battlefield. America, a nation composed of a mixed populace of immigrants, Jews and African Americans, could not possibly contend with the martial spirit of the German Volk. However, the German assessment harbored a critical flaw. They evaluated America's potential based on its peacetime performance. Observing a nation that had not mobilized, they concluded it was incapable of doing so. They witnessed factories producing consumer goods and erroneously assumed those same facilities could not be repurposed for weapon manufacturing. They perceived a diverse population and mistakenly equated diversity with inherent weakness. They were demonstrably wrong on every count. The transformation began even before America officially entered the fray. In the summer of 1940, with France having fallen and Britain under siege, Roosevelt issued a challenge to American industry, imploring them to achieve what he termed a miracle of production. Automobile factories ceased their car production. Appliance plants halted their refrigerator manufacturing. Every machine tool, every stamping press, every assembly line across America was redirected towards wartime output. This was not simply a call to arms. It represented a fundamental reorientation of the American economy. In 1941, more than 3 million automobiles rolled off American assembly lines. Over the subsequent 4 years, a mere 139 additional vehicles would be produced. The entire manufacturing capacity of the automotive industry was reallocated to armaments. Chrysler produced aircraft fuselages. General Motors manufactured aircraft engines, weaponry, trucks, and tanks. Packard supplied Rolls-Royce engines for the British Air Force. Companies that had previously produced nothing more formidable than kitchen appliances were now tasked with the fabrication of ammunition. This conversion occurred with astonishing rapidity, facilitated by capabilities within American industry that the Germans consistently underestimated. The linchpin was standardization and the utilization of interchangeable parts. American factories had pioneered mass production techniques, enabling disparate facilities to manufacture components that integrated seamlessly. A carburetor produced in Ohio would function perfectly with an engine assembled in Michigan, powering a vehicle put together in California. This system of interchangeable components had been meticulously developed over decades for civilian applications and was now ingeniously applied to the production of instruments of war. The skeptics insisted it was an impossible undertaking. Aircraft, they argued, were not automobiles. One could not simply stamp out a bomber in the same manner as a Ford. The required tolerances were far too exacting and the systems too intricately complex. A single heavy bomber comprised over 1 million individual parts, whereas an automobile contained approximately 15,000. Henry Kaiser, undeterred by the naysayers, secured a government contract in December of 1940 to construct 30 cargo vessels for the British. He possessed neither a shipyard nor any experience in shipbuilding, nor a workforce trained in maritime construction. What he did possess was a system. The system was the critical factor. Kaiser approached shipbuilding not as a traditional craftsman, but as a manufacturing challenge. The specific product, whether a ship, a dam, or a highway, held less significance than the underlying process. Every manufacturing process, in his view, could be dissected, its components analyzed, optimized, and scaled. Traditional shipbuilders relied on accumulated knowledge through apprenticeships, where a skilled riveter might dedicate years to mastering their craft. Kaiser lacked years. He had months. Consequently, he devised processes that could be learned within days. He strategically substituted machinery for manual labor wherever feasible, investing in equipment to perform tasks previously executed by hand. The established shipbuilders vehemently opposed this approach, asserting its inadequacy for the inherent complexity of ships and the unforgiving nature of the ocean, predicting that vessels constructed by amateurs would inevitably founder. Kaiser decisively refuted their claims. His ships were not only constructed with unprecedented speed, but also with superior quality. The defect rate at Kaiser shipyards was less than half that of conventional facilities. The same systematic methodology that accelerated production also enhanced quality. Kaiser applied the identical principles that had enabled the timely completion of the Hoover Dam. He fragmented the shipbuilding process into modular components. Rather than constructing a ship from its keel upwards on a solitary slipway, he prefabricated entire sections in various locations, subsequently assembling them like building blocks. He embraced welding over riveting, a technique that proved both faster and less labor-intensive, requiring fewer skilled personnel. He actively recruited workers from across the nation, providing them with housing, establishing childcare facilities for their families, and creating a comprehensive healthcare system to ensure their health and productivity. The transformation of ordinary Americans into skilled shipbuilders occurred at a pace that defied conventional expectations. Men and women who had never witnessed the ocean, never wielded a welding torch, or set foot in an industrial complex, acquired the expertise to construct vessels within weeks. Kaiser's training programs were exceptionally efficient. A new recruit could achieve proficiency as a welder in 10 days, and within 30 days, they could contribute effectively as part of a shipbuilding team. The workforce comprised individuals from diverse backgrounds: Oklahoman farmers displaced by the Dust Bowl, factory workers from Detroit facing layoffs during the Depression, women entering the workforce for the first time, and African Americans seeking opportunities denied to them in the segregated South. The workforce at Kaiser's Richmond yards ultimately reached a peak exceeding 90,000 individuals, with nearly a third being women. These women, employed in the factories, became potent symbols of American wartime mobilization. They expertly drilled rivets, meticulously welded seams, and skillfully installed wiring, performing tasks that had been exclusively the domain of men prior to the war. The government actively promoted their contributions through evocative posters and films that featured strong, determined women in industrial settings, solidifying their iconic status as representatives of the home front effort. Thousands of such women across America, working in shipyards and aircraft plants, powerfully demonstrated that the labor pool could expand in ways that German strategists had never anticipated. The established shipbuilding firms observed these developments with utter disbelief. Having adhered to the same construction methods for decades, they believed they understood the limits of possibility. Kaiser's innovations contravened every tenet of their craft. Ships, they insisted, should be riveted, not welded. Construction should occur on the slipway, not in decentralized fabrication shops. Workers required years of training, not weeks. Yet Kaiser's methods proved undeniably effective. In 1941, the average construction time for a Liberty ship, the standard cargo vessel of the war, stood at 230 days. By 1942, Kaiser's yards had reduced this time frame to 45 days, then to 30, and subsequently to 20. In November of 1942, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard launched the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in a remarkable 4 days and 15 hours, a feat that required less time from keel laying to completion than a German U-boat needed to traverse the Atlantic. The Germans now confronted an unforeseen strategic crisis. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, had based his strategy on a straightforward calculation. His submarines would sink Allied shipping at a rate exceeding the Allies' capacity to replace it. During the initial months of 1942, this strategy appeared highly successful. German U-boats patrolled the American East Coast during what they termed the Second Happy Time, sinking hundreds of merchant vessels within plain sight of land. Oil tankers ignited off the coast of Florida, and cargo ships sank within view of New Jersey's beaches. Reinhard Hartigan, commander of U-123, was among the first captains to engage in operations in American waters. In January of 1942, he torpedoed ships so close to the shore that he could discern the illuminated glow of city lights reflecting off the smoke. The Americans had neglected to implement blackout procedures and had failed to organize convoys, seemingly inviting attack. Hartigan sank 8 ships on his inaugural patrol, returning to Germany as a celebrated hero. Other U-boat commanders followed suit. Throughout the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank nearly 400 vessels in American coastal waters. The losses were catastrophic. Oil destined to fuel Allied tanks pooled on Atlantic beaches. Food intended for British civilians decomposed at the bottom of the sea. Strategic materials vital to the war effort vanished beneath the waves. Dönitz believed he was achieving victory. His submarines were inflicting damage at a rate surpassing his most optimistic projections. If these losses continued, Britain would be strangled into submission, and the American war effort would falter before it could fully mobilize. Yet, even as the U-boats tallied their successes, the shipyards were accelerating their output. In 1942, American shipyards launched 8 million tons of new shipping. In 1943, this figure surged to 19 million tons. By the autumn of 1943, new construction surpassed losses for the first time. Every vessel the U-boats sank was replaced by 2 more. Dönitz observed these figures with mounting apprehension. His submarines were sinking ships at a rate that would have guaranteed victory in the First World War. However, this was not the First World War. It was a conflict against an adversary whose industrial capacity defied all comprehension. The mathematics were unforgiving. Dönitz had calculated that his U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons of shipping monthly to effectively strangle Britain. In 1942, they came close to this target, but by 1943, American shipyards alone were launching in excess of 1 million tons per month. The objective continued to recede, remaining perpetually out of reach. Compounding the issue, the Americans were adapting and learning. The initial disasters off the East Coast had exposed critical weaknesses in anti-submarine warfare. Convoys were systematically organized, and aircraft were deployed to patrol shipping lanes. New technologies, such as radar and improved sonar, provided the defenders with advantages they had previously lacked. In May of 1943, Dönitz was compelled to withdraw his U-boats from the Atlantic. In a single month, 43 submarines were lost, and the tonnage they sank no longer justified the casualties they sustained. The Battle of the Atlantic, a crucial victory Germany needed to achieve to strangle Britain, had been definitively lost. The U-boat crews who survived the May catastrophe returned to occupied France in a state of shock. They had embarked on their missions believing they were prevailing, only to return to port realizing they had been defeated. The endless convoys they had hunted now sailed with escorts that were impenetrable. The Allied aircraft, once a rarity, now seemed omnipresent. The technological superiority that German submarines had once enjoyed had vanished. What transpired at sea was mirrored in the air. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, situated outside Detroit, emerged as a potent symbol of American industrial prowess. Designed by the renowned industrial architect Albert Kahn, the facility spanned 3.5 million square feet, establishing it as the largest single-roof factory globally. Its designated purpose was the mass production of the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber, a machine of unprecedented complexity for Ford. The challenges were immense. The B-24 comprised over 1 million individual parts and more than 300,000 rivets of 55 distinct sizes. It demanded precision engineering far beyond the scope of the automobile industry's prior experience. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, scrutinized the manufacturing methods of consolidated aircraft and deemed them rudimentary. Bombers were being assembled outdoors by hand, employing techniques that had remained unchanged for decades. Sorensen proposed a revolutionary concept. He would build bombers on a moving assembly line, mirroring the process used for automobiles. Critics decried the idea as preposterous. Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, scoffed, likening the notion to expecting a blacksmith to craft a wristwatch overnight. The skepticism was not entirely unfounded. Aircraft manufacturing differed fundamentally from automobile production. A car could accommodate minor variations without compromising its functionality. However, an aircraft with even slight deviations could potentially plummet from the sky. Tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch, and the materials involved were exotic alloys that behaved distinctly from automotive steel. The intricate systems, hydraulics, electrical, and pneumatic, had to function in perfect synchronization at altitudes of 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures. Ford encountered initial difficulties. The government repeatedly altered the aircraft's design, disrupting the assembly line's rhythm. Workers required extensive retraining for entirely new skill sets. The press derisively labeled the facility Willow Run instead of Willow Run. Senator Harry Truman initiated an investigation into the delays, publicly questioning Ford's capacity to fulfill its commitments. The problems were indeed substantial. Consolidated Aircraft, the designer of the B-24, continued to implement modifications based on combat feedback. Each alteration necessitated Ford retooling its assembly line. Ds, costing thousands of dollars, became obsolete overnight. Workers who had mastered one particular process had to be retrained for another. Ford's response was characterized by characteristic tenacity. The company deployed 200 engineers to work around the clock, converting Consolidated's hand-drawn schematics into precise manufacturing specifications. They produced 5 miles of technical drawings daily. When Consolidated modifications rendered drawings obsolete before they could be implemented, Ford engineers would restart the process without complaint. The company also decentralized production. Rather than building entire aircraft at Willow Run, Ford established a network of subcontractors responsible for manufacturing components, which were then transported to the main plant for final assembly. Engines were sourced from Buick in Flint. Propellers came from Hamilton Standard in Connecticut. Landing gear was supplied by Goodyear in Ohio. The sheer logistics of this operation would have been insurmountable for any organization that had not spent decades perfecting supply chain management. By 1944, these challenges were overcome. Willow Run began producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. At its peak production in April of 1944, the plant turned out 453 bombers in a single month. Between April 24th and April 26th of that year, 100 completed bombers departed from Willow Run within a mere 72 hours. The workers operated in 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The remaining 6 hours each day were allocated for restocking parts, performing maintenance, and reconfiguring tooling. Even with this relentless schedule, the workforce was reduced from 42,000 to 17,000 as efficiency improved. The same number of bombers required progressively fewer workers for their production. The Army Air Forces ultimately instructed Ford to decelerate production, as they lacked adequate space to park all the aircraft. Storage facilities at training bases overflowed with B-24s, awaiting crews. The production capacity exceeded the military's ability to deploy the aircraft. Concurrently, America's overall aircraft production reached levels that the German High Command had previously declared impossible. In 1944 alone, the United States manufactured over 96,000 military aircraft. That single year's production surpassed Japan's total aircraft output for the entirety of the war. American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945, accounting for approximately two-thirds of all Allied military equipment. The scale of this output defied comprehension. At its zenith, American industry was constructing more aircraft in a single month than Germany possessed at the war's outset. The assembly lines operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Shifts changed precisely at midnight and noon, with another change at noon again. The factories never ceased operation. Consider the practical implications of these figures. 300,000 aircraft, positioned wingtip to wingtip, would stretch for over 30,000 miles, a distance sufficient to encircle the Earth at the equator. The fuel required to operate these aircraft necessitated an entire petroleum infrastructure, including tankers, pipelines, and refineries dedicated solely to aviation gasoline. The crews to pilot these machines required a training establishment that processed hundreds of thousands of young men through programs that transformed civilians into combat aviators in less than a year. The magnitude of American mobilization extended beyond mere statistical data. Behind every aircraft, every ship, every tank lay a complex supply chain that traced back to mines, forests, and farms across the continent. Aluminum was derived from bauxite ore, shipped from South America. Rubber was sourced from plantations in Liberia and Brazil, following the Japanese conquests that severed Asian supplies. Cotton for uniforms originated from southern farms. Food was supplied by the agricultural heartland. The entire economy was reoriented towards the production of war materials. Women who had never worked outside their homes learned to operate machinery their mothers had never encountered. African Americans migrated north to secure factory positions previously inaccessible to them. Inhabitants of rural communities migrated to bustling industrial metropolises, where a severe housing scarcity compelled families to adopt a novel living arrangement. Day shift laborers would occupy beds newly vacated by their night shift counterparts. This profound societal upheaval mirrored the equally dramatic Industrial Revolution. Germany found itself confronting the repercussions of its flawed strategic foresight in the aerial battlefields over Europe. Their aviators were among the most rigorously trained globally, and their warplanes, notably formidable fighters such as the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, were exceptional machines. In singular aerial encounters, German pilots frequently outperformed their American adversaries. The nascent American bomber crews were lamentably green. Numerous pilots possessed fewer than 300 hours of cumulative flight experience when they commenced combat sorties. Navigation blunders led formations astray by miles. Bombing precision was suboptimal. Synchronization with fighter escorts remained imperfect. German aviators shrewdly exploited these vulnerabilities. The Luftwaffe devised specific stratagems engineered to disrupt bomber formations and isolate stragglers. Head-on assaults at closing velocities exceeding 600 miles per hour afforded gunners mere seconds for engagement. German fighters, outfitted with rockets, could engage from distances beyond the effective range of defensive machine guns. Nevertheless, the relentless attrition took its toll. For every German aircraft downed, the Americans could field 3 more. For every seasoned German pilot lost, the Americans possessed the capacity to train 5 replacements. The Luftwaffe gradually withered, not through a singular decisive defeat, but from the cumulative pressure of an adversary capable of absorbing losses and persisting. The American training infrastructure operated on an industrial scale in its own right. Flight academies processed thousands of aspiring cadets concurrently. Instructors completed multiple training missions each day. Aircraft were readily available in abundance, as the very factories constructing combat planes also manufactured trainers. The entire system was optimized for high throughput, transforming raw potential into operational readiness with maximum efficiency. By the middle of 1944, the Luftwaffe was experiencing monthly losses equivalent to 25% of its aircrews and 40% of its aircraft. These were casualties no aerial force could sustain indefinitely. The Thousand-Year Reich did not possess 1,000 years' worth of pilots to sacrifice. German aviators who had initiated the war with years of training and hundreds of flight hours were superseded by individuals who had undergone mere weeks of instruction and logged dozens of hours in the cockpit. The average experience level of Luftwaffe fighter pilots steadily declined throughout 1944. By the war's conclusion, some German pilots embarked on their inaugural combat mission with less than 100 hours of total flight time. Concurrently, the Americans continued to refine their capabilities. The initial bomber crews had been distressingly inexperienced, but those who survived the 1943 raids transitioned into the instructors who would train the 1944 crews. Tactics evolved, and equipment saw significant improvements. The P-51 Mustang, with its extended range and exceptional performance, finally provided bomber formations with the crucial protection they required. Germany's strategic miscalculations extended beyond industrial capacity to encompass the combat effectiveness of American soldiers themselves. In February of 1943, American ground forces engaged the German army in combat for the initial time at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The encounter appeared to validate every preconceived German bias. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps decisively routed the inexperienced American positions. Units disintegrated and retreated. Equipment was abandoned. Command and control structures collapsed. American casualties surpassed 6,000. Certain German officers, who had previously dismissed Americans as effeminate, now possessed battlefield evidence to support their disdain. The American forces at Kasserine exhibited a raw inexperience that only combat could expose. Many soldiers had never discharged their weapons in earnest. Officers who had undergone years of training under peacetime conditions found themselves incapable of functioning under fire. Radio communications faltered. Coordination between infantry and armored units broke down. Formations that should have provided mutual support operated in isolation. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, son-in-law to General George Patton, was among those captured during this debacle. He had led an armored counter-assault against German positions near Sidi Bou Zid. The attack drove directly into German panzer units and anti-tank guns strategically positioned in a classic ambush. American tanks erupted in flames. Infantry units scattered. Waters sustained injuries, was taken prisoner, and spent the remainder of the war in a German POW camp. Narratives similar to his proliferated across the battlefield. American artillery was poorly situated. American infantry constructed foxholes in suboptimal locations. American armor advanced without adequate reconnaissance. The Germans, who had been engaged in desert warfare for 2 years, exploited every misstep with professional precision. Rommel himself initially disparaged the green American troops. They appeared undisciplined and inadequately led when contrasted with the British forces he had been confronting for 2 years. The catastrophe at Kasserine reinforced the German conviction that American material superiority could be neutralized by German combat prowess. Reports from the engagement filtered back to Berlin. German intelligence officers compiled assessments that substantiated Hitler's long-held beliefs. The Americans were weak. Their materiel was abundant, but their soldiers were fragile. German fighting spirit would ultimately triumph over American industrial might. However, Rommel was too adept a general to allow initial impressions to solidify into immutable assumptions. He observed the developments following Kasserine, and what he witnessed troubled him. The Americans demonstrated remarkable resilience and recovered with startling swiftness. Within weeks of the disaster, they reorganized their formations. removed incompetent commanders, and implemented the brutal lessons learned. General George Patton assumed command of the dispirited Second Corps and, through sheer force of will, transformed it. Tactics improved. Inter-unit coordination among infantry, armor, and artillery became more precise. Air support grew more effective. Patton was an overwhelming force. He descended upon the Second Corps like a tempest, demanding stringent discipline, penalizing sloppiness, and driving his men to achieve standards they had never previously attained. Soldiers who had moved listlessly through the Kasserine disaster found themselves diligently polishing brass, standing at rigid attention, and undergoing training more rigorous than any they had experienced before. Yet, Patton accomplished more than merely imposing discipline. He meticulously analyzed the reasons for the American failures and instituted specific remedial actions. Artillery forward observers were repositioned. Tank tactics were revised. Infantry units were trained to coordinate more closely with armored elements. The critical lessons of Kasserine were thoroughly analyzed, officially documented, and disseminated. The American military possessed an institutional commitment to learning from setbacks, a trait the Germans failed to recognize. Following Kasserine, the Army's ground forces commander, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, conducted a comprehensive review of the preceding failures. His findings were transmitted to training camps across the United States, where they informed the preparation of divisions yet to be deployed. The errors of February 1943 became the curriculum of March 1943. Rommel later recorded his observations. The tactical execution of the enemy's defense, he wrote, was first class. They recovered very rapidly after the initial shock and soon succeeded in halting our advance. Unlike many German generals, Rommel avoided the error of underestimating the speed at which Americans learned from their failures. Carlo d'Este, a historian who studied Rommel's personal papers, noted that the Desert Fox observed a significant development in American forces after Kasserine. Things had rapidly improved for them, he stated. Rommel wrote, "Although we had to wait until the Patton Army in France to witness the most astonishing achievement in mobile warfare, even after the initial disaster, Rommel recognized that he was observing an opponent destined to improve." By May of 1943, a mere 3 months after Kasserine, the North African campaign had concluded. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into prisoner of war enclosures, a number exceeding those who surrendered at Stalingrad. The Americans, who had panicked at Kasserine, now stood among the victors. The rapidity of the American recovery astonished German commanders who had anticipated a prolonged period of demoralization. In their experience, units that had been routed typically required months to regain their fighting effectiveness. The Americans achieved this reconstitution in weeks. The psychological resilience demonstrated by this rapid recovery was perhaps more disconcerting than their material advantages. German prisoners captured in Tunisia reported their astonishment at American logistical capabilities. The American soldiers they encountered seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply of ammunition, fuel, and sustenance. When German units ran low on provisions, they were forced to improvise. Conversely, when American units faced shortages, replacement supplies arrived within days. The implication was clear to the German intelligence officers who analyzed the North African campaign. Material superiority could indeed compensate for inexperience. The Americans had been outfought at Kasserine, but they had never been outproduced. As long as American factories continued to operate, American armies would persist in their fight. The crucial question was whether Germany could achieve victory quickly enough to render the production disparity irrelevant. Following Tunisia, the answer to that question became unequivocally no. This pattern recurred throughout the war. American forces initially faltered, learned with remarkable speed, and continuously improved. The very troops who had retreated before German tanks in Tunisia would later storm the beaches of Normandy and fight their way across France. The same aviators who had been outmaneuvered by veteran Luftwaffe pilots would ultimately clear the German Air Force from the skies. This adaptive capacity was intrinsically woven into American institutions. The Army's Ground Forces Command maintained a continuous feedback loop between active combat units and training establishments. After-action reports from the front lines were meticulously analyzed within weeks and integrated into revised training programs. Military doctrine was updated based on practical battlefield experience. Equipment was modified to address issues identified by soldiers engaged in combat. The system was not always elegant, it was often chaotic. Different units independently developed distinct solutions to similar challenges. Coordination between different branches of the military was not always seamless, but the inherent chaos proved productive. Successful innovations endured and propagated, while unsuccessful ones were discarded. Consequently, the organization as a whole grew more effective, even when individual components struggled. In stark contrast, German military culture had become ossified around rigid doctrines and personal allegiances. Initiative was actively discouraged, and failure frequently jeopardized careers. The same inflexibility that had facilitated brilliant early victories became a significant liability when circumstances shifted. The Wehrmacht could execute plans with devastating efficiency, but it struggled to adapt when those plans encountered unforeseen obstacles. Hitler exacerbated this rigidity by constantly interfering in military operations, overriding his generals based on intuition rather than empirical analysis. Commanders learned that disagreeing with the Führer risked their careers at best and their lives at worst. The candid assessments that could have guided German strategy toward correction were suppressed in favor of reports that catered to Hitler's preconceived notions. The disparity between American and German organizational cultures was most starkly evident in their approach to failure. When American commanders erred, they were typically relieved of their posts, but rarely punished. General Lloyd Friedendahl, who had commanded during the Kasserine debacle, was removed from his command but reassigned to train new troops in the United States. His experience, even a failed one, was deemed valuable. Conversely, when German commanders failed, they risked not only their careers, but also their lives. Following the assassination attempt in July 1944, Hitler's paranoia intensified. Generals suspected of disloyalty were summarily executed. Even success offered no guarantee of safety if it came at the expense of defying Hitler's directives. This created a culture of conformity at the most critical juncture. German officers who recognized the strategic impossibility of their situation frequently remained silent, as speaking truthfully was considered too perilous. The information that reached Hitler was filtered through numerous individuals who conveyed what he desired to hear rather than what he genuinely needed to know. The German generals who had initially dismissed the combat quality of American soldiers at Kasserine never fully revised their assessments. They attributed American successes solely to abundant materiel, refusing to acknowledge the organizational learning that amplified the effectiveness of that abundance. They persisted in the belief that German martial spirit could overcome American industrial power, even as American armies pushed them back across France, over the Rhine, and into the very heart of Germany. When D-Day commenced in June 1944, German commanders stationed in France were taken aback by the sheer magnitude of the invasion force. Over 156,000 Allied troops landed on the initial day, supported by nearly 7,000 naval vessels and 11,000 aircraft. The logistical feat required to transport this massive force across the English Channel and sustain it on hostile shores represented an organizational accomplishment that German planners had deemed beyond possibility. The American contribution to the invasion was overwhelming. The equipment instrumental in supporting the assault, including landing craft, transport aircraft, tanks, and trucks that advanced inland from the beaches, originated predominantly from American manufacturing facilities. The vessels that bombarded German defenses were constructed in American shipyards. The aircraft that dominated the skies were produced on American assembly lines. German defenders fought with their characteristic tenacity. In certain sectors, they inflicted substantial casualties upon the attackers, but they were ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer volume of men and materiel deployed by the Allies. When an American infantry company encountered a fortified position, they requested artillery support. The ensuing barrage was not a few rounds, but hundreds, often thousands, of shells concentrated in barrages that pulverized defensive strongholds. As the infantry advanced, tanks provided crucial support. When the tanks encountered insurmountable obstacles, aircraft were called into action. The Americans had mastered the integration of combined arms in a manner that exponentially amplified their combat power. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front noted that the American approach to warfare differed significantly from Soviet tactics. The Soviets tended to hurl masses of men at problems. The Americans, conversely, deployed overwhelming quantities of machines. The outcome, however, was often similar. Immense force applied relentlessly, but with a considerably lower human cost to the Americans. This was a deliberate, strategic choice. American doctrine explicitly prioritized firepower over manpower. The question became, why risk soldiers when ammunition could be expended instead? Hitler's misjudgments carried consequences that permeated every stratum of German strategy. Because he harbored the conviction that America would not intervene decisively, he declared war on the United States a mere 4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, thereby drawing an adversary into the conflict that he need not have antagonized. Because he believed American industry was incapable of fulfilling its promises, he allowed the U-boat campaign to persist long after it had ceased to be strategically viable. Because he viewed American soldiers as lacking in fortitude, he failed to adequately reinforce the Western Front until it was far too late. The declaration of war against America in December of 1941 remains one of the most inexplicable strategic decisions of the 20th century. Germany was not contractually obligated to declare war under the Tripartite Pact with Japan. That agreement stipulated mutual defense solely if one partner was attacked, not if one partner initiated hostilities against others. Hitler possessed the option to maintain neutrality toward America while Japan engaged in conflict in the Pacific. His advisors brought this to his attention. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop reminded Hitler that a declaration of war would introduce an additional adversary without any corresponding strategic benefit. However, Hitler dismissed these concerns. He maintained that war with America was inevitable and that Germany might as well strike first. More significantly, he fundamentally underestimated America's importance. He perceived the nation as a collection of racial mongrels, fractured by class divisions and corrupted by Jewish influence, and therefore incapable of impacting the war's ultimate outcome. This profound contempt shaped German strategic planning throughout the entire conflict. Resources that could have been allocated to bolster the U-boat fleet were diverted elsewhere, as the American industrial threat was not taken seriously. Reinforcements that might have strengthened North African defenses were dispatched to the Eastern Front, as the Mediterranean was considered a secondary theater. Preparations for an Allied invasion were consequently inadequate because the true scale of American power was not fully comprehended. The individuals who had dismissed American production figures as mere propaganda watched those figures materialize into reality. The generals who had scorned American combat prowess found themselves in a strategic retreat before advancing American armies. The strategists who had calculated that Germany could prevail in a war of attrition discovered that attrition ultimately favored the side possessing greater reserves. By 1944, Germany was engaged in combat on 3 separate fronts, with resources barely sufficient for a single one. The Eastern Front absorbed the majority of Germany's military strength. The Mediterranean theater drained divisions that could have been deployed to defend France. And the relentless bombing campaign, conducted primarily by American aircraft, devastated German industry and its cities. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, dispatched formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers on daylight raids over Germany, operations that would have been impossible without America's vast industrial capacity. The initial raids incurred terrible losses. German fighters and anti-aircraft artillery exacted a heavy toll, but the Americans absorbed these losses and persisted. In October of 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 heavy bombers and their crews in a single raid targeting Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories. These losses were proportionally more severe than anything the German Air Force had experienced. American commanders debated the feasibility of continuing daylight bombing missions, but American factories replaced the lost aircraft within weeks. Replacement crews arrived from training programs that had been significantly expanded to meet the escalating demand. By the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force was demonstrably stronger than it had been prior to the Schweinfurt raid, and crucially, it now possessed long-range escort fighters, the P-51 Mustang, capable of safeguarding the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe confronted an insurmountable mathematical problem. Every American aircraft shot down was replaced by 3 more. Every experienced German pilot lost was irretrievable. The balance of attrition, which German strategists had confidently predicted would favor their superior training and tactics, had decisively reversed. Hermann Göring, who had dismissed American production claims as pure fantasy, lived to witness his Air Force decimated by the very industrial might he had so contemptuously mocked. Post-war, in a prison interview, he conceded that the pace of American shipbuilding, particularly under Henry Kaiser's innovative program, had both surprised and deeply concerned German planners. Claims of constructing ships in 8 to 10 days had initially seemed fantastical. However, they were not fantastical. They were demonstrably true. By the spring of 1945, the Thousand-Year Reich was in the process of collapse. American and British forces advanced relentlessly from the west, while Soviet armies closed in from the east. German cities burned under a round-the-clock bombing offensive that the Luftwaffe was powerless to repel. The factories that had once produced the Reich's armaments were reduced to rubble. The final months of the war starkly exposed the profound and comprehensive failure of German strategic planning. Germany's strategic reserves were utterly depleted. The nation's fuel supply was exhausted. The transportation network lay in ruins. Industries that had miraculously survived years of bombing finally succumbed to the systematic destruction of their supply chains. German soldiers continued to fight with their characteristic stubbornness, but they did so without any semblance of hope. Ammunition was strictly rationed. Vehicles were abandoned due to a lack of fuel. Replacement equipment ceased to arrive, as the factories responsible for its production no longer functioned. The Reich, which had once conquered most of Europe, was reduced to desperately scavenging for basic supplies. American forces, conversely, appeared to possess virtually limitless resources. When tanks were destroyed, new tanks were promptly delivered. As military material was depleted, replacements materialized. The supply chain underpinning the Allied offensive was, in itself, a testament to industrial prowess, transporting millions of tons of provisions across an ocean and a continent to the front lines. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy network that sustained Allied forces following the breakthrough at Normandy, delivered 400,000 tons of supplies in a mere 3 months. American drivers, many of them African Americans serving in segregated transportation units, operated around the clock to ensure the advancing armies were continuously provisioned with fuel, munitions, and sustenance. The convoy consumed more fuel than the combat units it supported. However, America possessed a surplus of fuel, whereas Germany did not. This abundance extended to every facet of American military operations. American soldiers were served hot meals, while German soldiers resorted to foraging. American units benefited from medical support that evacuated wounded personnel to field hospitals within hours. German casualties often perished awaiting treatment that never arrived. American armies had access to spare parts for damaged equipment, while German forces cannibalized broken vehicles to keep others operational. Adolf Hitler perished in his underground command center on April 30, 1945, still resolute in his conviction that his assessments had been accurate. If Germany had suffered defeat, he believed it was because the German populace had failed him, his generals had betrayed him, and fate had conspired against him. He never came to terms with the fundamental inaccuracies in his assumptions about America. In his final days, Hitler raved about phantom armaments that would alter the conflict's trajectory, about military formations that existed only on paper, and about counteroffensives that were impossibly destined for failure. He had lost his grip on reality years prior, yet his delusions regarding American weakness persisted until his demise. The nation he had derided as racially inferior and industrially incapable had annihilated his armies. The evidence was incontrovertible. The nation he had dismissed as decadent had outproduced Germany by a factor approaching 3-1. The populace he had characterized as weak had fought with unwavering resolve and ferocity across two vast oceans. The industrial capacity he had scoffed at as mere propaganda had buried the Wehrmacht under an overwhelming deluge of steel and explosives. The statistics unequivocally told the story. American industry furnished nearly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment manufactured during the war. 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, and 2 million army trucks. These figures were not propaganda. They represented stark reality. Henry J. Kaiser did not achieve widespread name recognition following the war. He reverted to private industry, eventually establishing hospitals, manufacturing automobiles, and developing housing complexes. The shipyards that had launched a vessel every few days were subsequently dismantled or repurposed for civilian manufacturing. The workers who had accomplished feats deemed impossible by established experts returned to their ordinary vocations. The Willow Run plant, which had produced more bombers than Germany could intercept, was acquired by other manufacturers. For decades thereafter, it churned out automobiles instead of aircraft. The assembly lines that had generated B-24 Liberators every 63 minutes were reconfigured for civilian production. By the time General Motors ceased operations at the facility in 2010, few individuals recalled its wartime achievements. The men and women who had constituted the arsenal of democracy dispersed back into their regular lives. The welders returned to agricultural pursuits and factory work. The riveters became homemakers and educators. The laborers who had achieved production miracles that German intelligence had dismissed as fictitious faded into obscurity. However, some among them retained their memories. Charles E. Sorensen, the Ford executive instrumental in designing the Willow Run assembly line, penned a memoir detailing his team's accomplishments. Kaiser's shipyard employees established reunion associations that convened for decades after the war. The women who had toiled in factories across America were eventually commemorated with the establishment of the Rosie the Riveter National World War II Homefront National Historical Park at the site of the Richmond shipyards in 2000. The lessons derived from their achievements should not be forgotten. Germany's miscalculation of America was not merely an intelligence failure, it was a failure of imagination. The German leadership perceived America through the lens of their preconceived notions, expecting to see a feeble, divided, undisciplined nation ill-suited for conflict. They failed to recognize the reality, a slumbering giant possessing industrial might, organizational acumen, and human determination that would prove indomitable once roused. Isoroku Yamamoto, the Japanese admiral who orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, comprehended what the Germans failed to grasp. He had studied in America and was aware of its latent capabilities. Following the Pearl Harbor assault, he purportedly cautioned that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and instilled within it a formidable resolve. Germany never possessed a comparable voice of prudence because it never regarded America with sufficient seriousness to conduct a thorough examination. The factories that birthed Liberty ships and B-24 bombers have largely been demolished. The workforce that operated them has passed into history. The war they helped to secure concluded 8 decades ago. Yet their narrative remains significant because misjudgment continues to exact a toll. Nations persist in underestimating their adversaries. Leaders continue to equate their assumptions with reality. The German High Command believed what it wished to believe about America, a conviction that led to catastrophic miscalculation. The origins of Germany's flawed judgment were deeply embedded. Nazi ideology posited that racial purity formed the bedrock of national strength. America, with its heterogeneous immigrant population and African-American citizens, seemed to challenge this tenet merely by its existence. If the Nazi racial paradigm held true, America should have been weak. Consequently, German leaders convinced themselves that America must be weak. This represented the fundamental error. German strategists commenced with their conclusions and worked backward to find corroborating evidence. They observed America's unpreparedness in 1939 and inferred that Americans were incapable of preparation. They noted America's diversity and concluded that Americans could not achieve unity. They perceived America's affluence and surmised that Americans were unwilling to make sacrifices. Each conclusion proved erroneous. Americans mobilized with unprecedented speed. Americans united behind the war effort with remarkable solidarity. Americans endured sacrifices that would have seemed unimaginable prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. However, German leadership could not perceive this, as acknowledging it would have necessitated abandoning assumptions central to their worldview. History does not merely repeat itself, it echoes. The generals and admirals who dismissed American production figures as propaganda, who derided American combat effectiveness, who believed that material abundance could not counterbalance German martial tradition, were not unintelligent individuals. They were competent professionals who allowed preconceptions to supersede evidence. They observed an America shaped by their assumptions and disregarded the America that actually existed. The industrial might that vanquished Nazi Germany did not materialize spontaneously. It stemmed from the shipyard workers in Richmond who maintained their shifts around the clock, from the assembly line workers at Willow Run who constructed aircraft at an unparalleled pace, from the farmers, shopkeepers, and teachers who donned uniforms and acquired the skills of combat. These were not superhuman individuals. They were simply ordinary people who performed extraordinary deeds when circumstances demanded it. The housewives who became welders had never envisioned themselves working in factories. The farmers who became soldiers had never contemplated crossing oceans to engage in combat. The civil servants who became logistics officers had never imagined orchestrating operations across continents. Nevertheless, they undertook these tasks. They acquired skills they previously lacked. They endured hardships they had not anticipated. They achieved feats that experts deemed impossible. And once the war concluded, most returned to their ordinary lives, rarely speaking of their wartime experiences. Germany's flawed judgment ultimately represented a failure to comprehend human potential. Hitler observed Americans and focused on their limitations, overlooking their capacity for growth, adaptation, and their ability to confront seemingly insurmountable challenges. He mistook the America of peacetime for the America that would emerge under duress. This is perhaps the most crucial lesson of all. Nations are not immutable entities. Societies are not static. The capabilities present during peacetime do not necessarily define the limits of what is achievable during wartime. A nation that appears vulnerable at one moment can become formidable the next, provided its populace possesses the will and the organizational capacity for mobilization. Germany had meticulously built its military over years of preparation. The Wehrmacht that invaded Poland in 1939 was the culmination of decades of planning, training, and investment. German strategists assumed this initial advantage was decisive, believing no nation could bridge the gap swiftly enough to make a difference. They were mistaken. America closed the disparity within months, not by matching German quality, a process that would have required years, but by overwhelming German quantity with American abundance. The American approach differed from the German strategy, being less refined and less elegant, yet ultimately more effective. Hitler viewed America as a decaying nation incapable of cohesion. He was looking at the wrong America. The America that truly mattered was not the one dictated by his prejudices, but the one that constructed ships in days and bombers in hours. It was the America that transformed raw recruits into combat-ready soldiers within months. It was the America that absorbed setbacks, learned from them, and emerged stronger. That America, the genuine America, was characterized by a degree of messiness, chaos, and inefficiency by German standards. Yet it emerged victorious. If you found this narrative as captivating as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It aids us in sharing more overlooked stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to remain connected with these untold histories. Each one holds significance. Each one merits remembrance, and we would be delighted to hear from you. Please leave a comment below indicating your location. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are an integral part of something special here. Thank you for watching and for helping to keep these stories alive. The history you have just encountered is not merely academic. It carries vitally important lessons that resonate into our present day. Nations continue to err by perceiving what they anticipate rather than what actually exists. Leaders persist in dismissing capabilities they do not comprehend. The repercussions of such misjudgment remain as profound as ever.